So we are going to see the solution of AP Physics 1 question paper for the year 2022. Okay. And this is the very first question, question number A. And this is the first part of the question. Okay. So I'll just first read out the question to you. This is saying that two blocks are connected by a string. The string here is connecting the blocks M1 and M2, right? And the string is passing over a pulley. Block 1 is on a horizontal surface. This block here is on the horizontal surface and is attached to a spring. This is the spring that is unstretched initially, right? That means it is in its natural length initially, the spring. Okay. Frictional forces are negligible. There is no friction force in the system, in the pulley or on the table, right, between the block and the surface. Block 2 is now released from rest and moves downward before momentarily coming to rest. Okay. Then we have to answer the given question here. That is the first part, right? In terms of only the forces directly exerted on the block 2, explain why block 2 initially speeds up and then explain why it slows down eventually. Nothing was moving initially and the spring here was in its natural length, right? So I'll again make the diagram here, right? So this is the situation here. The question is asking that block 2 starts from rest and speeds up, then it slows down, momentarily comes to rest at a position below the initial position. So I have to be talking about forces that are directly applied on the block M2, right? So I can see here on this M2 block, if I make a free body diagram of M2 here, there are only two forces acting on M2. The tension force here, T, in the upward direction, and the weight of M2 times the acceleration due to gravity, G. Okay. So there are only two forces. So whatever motion or change of velocity will happen to M2 will be due to these two forces only, right? So initially, when we release this one, what is happening? This weight, initially there was no tension, right? Because we were holding this mass M2 and there was no tension in this spring, right? So obviously this weight, let me write this as weight of M2, right? So what was happening initially? The weight of M2 was more than the tension, right? I can write initially weight of M2 was more than the tension force, right? That means this force in the downward direction is going to be more, okay? So this M2 is going to accelerate downwards and that is what is happening, right? But as M2 moves downward, what happens? That this M1 blocks move ahead and there is some elongation of the spring here, right? After some elongation, let's say this be the system here. The spring is elongated somewhat and this is the new situation. M2 has come down a bit, but that has resulted in some elongation of the spring, right? That means now spring will be pulling back, right? That will be changing the tension in the spring. But remember, the spring force is not directly applied on M2, right? So we just have to talk about the tension force. Obviously, since now there is a tension in the spring also, that changes the tension in the spring here. Okay. So now, due to the change in this one, the tension in the string will change. Now this tension starts increasing, right? It starts increasing and a time comes when the tension is balancing this M2G, the weight, okay? But then also it won't stop because at that time it will have some velocity, right? The block M2 will have some velocity when T is equal to the weight, okay? So it will continue to move downwards after that also. But after some time, the elongation in the spring is even more. That means the tension in the spring here is even more So after some time, what will happen? T is more than the weight of M2. That means now the force in the upward direction is more than the weight of M2. So there will be a retardation happening now. So slowly the speed of M2 will decrease and become zero. Okay, because now the tension force is more than the weight, so it is now decreasing, right? So yes, these three things happened. Initially the tension was zero, weight was more, it was accelerating downwards. After some time the tension in the string started to rise. Okay, at a point it will match up with the weight, but still it continues to move. After some more time the tension is more than the weight now. That means the acceleration is in the upward direction, though the velocity of this M2 is the downward direction. So that means the velocity of this one will start decreasing and eventually stop. So a time will come when M2, the velocity is zero. So that is what the question is asking. Explain why block 2 initially speeds up and explain why it slows down to a momentary stop. The spring force is not acted directly on this M2, so it doesn't have to do directly anything with the movement of M2, but certainly the tension in the spring is related with the tension in the spring. Okay, so this much is enough to explain for this question. Okay.